March 10, 1945, 2:47 a.m. The sky above Tokyo glows orange. Not the orange of sunrise, dawn is still hours away. This is the orange of a city burning from within. Flames climbing so high they illuminate the clouds themselves. The air smells of wood smoke and something chemical, acrid, wrong. On the ground, the roar is deafening. Not from explosions, but from fire consuming oxygen faster than lungs can pull it in. From his command post beneath the Imperial Palace, Lieutenant General Seizo Arisu stands frozen at a window reinforced with sandbags. He watches incendiary clusters rain down like falling stars, each one birthing a new inferno. His hands grip the windowsill. His mind struggles to process what his eyes are seeing. The bombers are still coming. They have been coming for hours. Wave after wave of B-29 superfortresses, flying so low he can hear the growl of their engines over the firestorm, and they are not stopping. The anti-aircraft guns have gone silent, either destroyed or abandoned. The night fighters have been swallowed by smoke. The city is defenseless. And still, the bombers come. Arisu has spent 30 years preparing for war. He has studied tactics, logistics, fortifications. But nothing in his training prepared him for this: an enemy that does not pause, does not retreat, does not tire. An enemy that has turned the sky itself into a weapon. This is not a raid. This is the end. To understand how Tokyo came to burn on that March night, you must step back 14 weeks. To the beginning of 1945, when the war in the Pacific had already been decided in all but name. By January, Japan's empire was collapsing inward like a dying star. The Philippine campaign had turned into a bloodbath. Iwo Jima, a volcanic speck 750 miles south of Tokyo, was about to become a slaughterhouse. Okinawa loomed on the horizon. American submarines had strangled Japan's merchant fleet, cutting off oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina. The home islands were starving, isolated, and almost entirely dependent on what little remained of their domestic production. The Imperial Japanese Army still commanded millions of men. The Navy, though shattered at Leyte Gulf, retained enough strength to make any invasion costly. But these forces were scattered across a shrinking perimeter, and Japan's leadership knew, though few would say it aloud, that victory was no longer possible. The question was no longer if Japan would be defeated, but how and at what cost. Meanwhile, 500 miles to the southeast, on the captured island of Saipan, a different kind of reckoning was taking shape. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, had fallen to American forces in the summer of 1944. Their capture had been expensive, thousands of Marines and soldiers killed in brutal jungle fighting. But the strategic payoff was immense. From airfields carved into Saipan's volcanic soil, the new Boeing B-29 superfortress could reach Tokyo. For the first time in the war, Japan's industrial heartland lay within range of sustained, heavy bombing. The B-29 was a marvel, a pressurized, high-altitude bomber capable of carrying 5 tons of ordnance over 3,000 miles. It could fly at 30,000 feet, above the effective ceiling of most Japanese fighters. Its 4 Wright R-3350 engines gave it speed and endurance no other bomber could match. On paper, it was the perfect weapon to dismantle Japan's war machine from the sky. But by early 1945, the reality was far more complicated. The initial bombing campaign, begun in November 1944 under Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, had been a disappointment. The strategy was orthodoxy: high-altitude, daylight precision bombing aimed at Japan's aircraft factories, engine plants, and steel mills. The same approach that had worked, eventually, over Germany. Except it wasn't working over Japan. The weather was the first problem. At 30,000 feet over the Japanese home islands, B-29 crews encountered the jet stream, a river of air moving at speeds up to 200 miles per hour. Bombardiers trying to hit factory complexes found their bombs scattered across miles of countryside. Cloud cover obscured targets for days at a time. Mechanical failures plagued the complex, temperamental B-29 engines. Abort rates ran as high as 20% on some missions, and the results, when bombs did hit, were marginal. Japan's war production was dispersed, decentralized, hidden in thousands of small workshops and cottage factories woven into residential neighborhoods. Precision strikes against individual plants barely dented overall output. Hansell believed in the doctrine. He believed that with time, better weather, improved training, the campaign would succeed. But time was something the Joint Chiefs of Staff were not willing to give. The invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, was already being planned for late 1945. Every week the bombing campaign failed to degrade Japan's ability to resist was a week closer to an invasion that would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. In January 1945, Hansel was quietly relieved of command. His replacement was Major General Curtis Emerson LeMay. LeMay was 38 years old, a cigar-chomping tactician who had earned his reputation over Europe, where he had pioneered aggressive formation tactics for daylight bombing raids deep into Nazi Germany. He was blunt, ruthless, and utterly uninterested in doctrine for its own sake. He cared about one thing: results. LeMay arrived on Guam on January 20, 1945, and immediately began studying the problem. He reviewed mission reports, interviewed crews, examined reconnaissance photos. The conclusion was unavoidable: the current strategy was failing. High-altitude precision bombing was not destroying Japan's war economy, and it was never going to. So LeMay made a decision that would redefine the air war and shock his own superiors almost as much as it would shock the Japanese. He would abandon precision. He would abandon daylight. He would abandon altitude. Instead, he would send his bombers in at night, at 5,000 to 7,000 feet, stripped of most defensive guns to carry maximum bomb loads. And he would burn Japan's cities to the ground. The decision was not made lightly, nor was it made in isolation. LeMay understood what he was proposing. Sending B-29s in low, at night, over heavily defended urban areas was a gamble that violated every principle of bomber doctrine. High altitude provided safety. Defensive armament provided protection. Daylight provided accuracy. LeMay was proposing to strip away all three. But he had reasons. Cold, calculated reasons born from months of frustration and mounting pressure. First, the weather. At 5,000 feet, below the worst of the cloud cover and entirely beneath the jet stream, bombardiers could actually see their targets. Navigation would be simpler. Bomb patterns would be tighter, more predictable. Second, the defenses. Japanese anti-aircraft capabilities were far weaker than Germany's had been. Flak batteries were fewer, older, less coordinated. Japanese night fighters existed, but they were primitive. Most lacked radar, relying instead on searchlights and visual contact. LeMay's intelligence officers estimated that losses might actually be lower at night and at low altitude than they had been during high-altitude daylight raids. Third, and most important, was the nature of Japanese cities themselves. Unlike the stone and concrete urban centers of Europe, Japanese cities were vast expanses of wood and paper. Centuries of earthquakes had taught Japanese builders to construct homes that flexed rather than shattered: lightweight frames, wooden walls, paper screens, tile roofs. Dense neighborhoods packed shoulder to shoulder, separated by narrow lanes barely wide enough for a cart. In short, they were tinderboxes. American intelligence analysts had studied this for months. They knew that incendiary bombs, specifically the M69 napalm cluster bomb, could create firestorms that would spread faster than any firefighting effort could contain. The M69 was a 6-pound canister filled with jellied gasoline. Dropped in clusters of 38, these bomblets would scatter across a target area, each one igniting on impact and burning at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. One B-29, stripped of guns and ammunition, could carry roughly 7 tons of incendiaries, over 450 individual M69 canisters. A single raid of 300 bombers could blanket an entire city district in fire. LeMay knew that attacking residential areas meant killing civilians. There was no avoiding that reality. But in Japan's distributed industrial system, those residential areas were the factory floor. Tens of thousands of homes contained small workshops producing aircraft parts, uniforms, ammunition components. The line between military and civilian infrastructure had been erased by Japan's own total war economy. And there was another calculus at work, one that LeMay and his superiors understood but rarely spoke aloud: breaking Japan's will to fight. By early 1945, American military planners were haunted by estimates of what an invasion of Japan would cost. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa, still to come, would validate their worst fears. Japanese soldiers fought to the death. Civilians threw themselves from cliffs rather than surrender. If that same fanaticism held on the home islands, Operation Downfall could result in 1 million American casualties. If the bombing campaign could convince Japan's leadership and its people that continued resistance was futile, it might make the invasion unnecessary, or at least less costly. This was the logic that guided Li Mei's hand as he planned what would become the most devastating series of air raids in human history. But what of the Japanese? What did they see coming? By early 1945, Japan's air defenses were a shadow of what they had once been. The fighter wings that had dominated the skies over China and the Pacific in 1941 had been ground down through 3.5 years of attrition. Experienced pilots were dead or too few. Replacement pilots received perhaps 100 hours of training compared to the 400+ hours American pilots received. Fuel shortages meant even veteran pilots rarely flew. Aircraft production remained relatively high. Japan was still building thousands of fighters per year, but quality had collapsed. Engines were unreliable. Materials were substituted. The once formidable Zero had been outclassed by American designs for 2 years. And the radar network, the invisible shield that had protected German cities until 1945, barely existed in Japan. A handful of coastal stations provided early warning, but coordination was poor, communication spotty. Japanese fighter controllers often learned of incoming raids from visual sightings rather than electronic detection. Japanese military commanders were not blind to their vulnerability. General Masakazu Kawab, commander of air defenses for the home islands, had submitted report after report warning that Japan's cities could not be defended against a sustained American bombing campaign. He begged for more fighters, more pilots, more fuel, better radar. But by 1945, there was nothing left to give. The strategy, such as it was, relied on dispersal and endurance. Factories were moved underground, into tunnels and caves. Essential government functions were decentralized. Citizens were trained in firefighting, given buckets and sand, and told to defend their neighborhoods. The rhetoric from Tokyo remained defiant, speak of Yamato Damashi, the indomitable Japanese spirit, of sacrifice and resistance to the last. But in the quiet moments, in the secure rooms where honest assessments were permitted, Japan's military leadership understood the truth. The Americans were coming, and there was no way to stop them. What those commanders did not yet understand, what they could not have imagined in those early months of 1945, was that the coming onslaught would not be a series of raids separated by days or weeks of respite. It would be a continuous, relentless, annihilating campaign that would give them no time to recover, no time to adapt, no time to breathe. The final air raid would never stop because it was not one raid. It was 100 raids, and they were just beginning. Li Mei's first incendiary test came on February 25, 1945, a raid against Tokyo involving 172 B-29s carrying a mix of high explosives and incendiaries. The results were promising but inconclusive. Approximately 1 square mile of the city burned. Losses were acceptable, 5 bombers downed. But it was not the overwhelming success Li Mei needed to justify the radical shift he was contemplating. So he pushed further. On March 4, Li Mei issued an order that sent shockwaves through his command staff. The next major raid, against Tokyo, scheduled for the night of March 9, would be conducted under entirely new parameters. Bombers would attack at 5,000 to 7,000 feet. They would fly at night. And most controversial of all, defensive gunners would be removed, their weapons stripped out to make room for more incendiaries. Each B-29 would carry nearly 7 tons of M69 cluster bombs. The crews were stunned. Flying low meant exposure to light flak and small arms fire. Flying at night meant navigation challenges, collision risks, and limited visibility. Removing defensive guns meant they would be helpless if Japanese fighters found them. Li Mei's response was clinical. Japanese night fighter effectiveness was negligible. Searchlights could be avoided. The weight saved by removing guns would allow each bomber to deliver 65% more ordnance. The math was simple. More bombs meant more destruction, and more destruction meant the war would end sooner. But there was another calculation buried in Li Mei's planning, one that would only become apparent years later. By stripping the guns and flying at night, Li Mei was also reducing the psychological burden on his crews. At 30,000 feet in daylight, bombardiers could see the city below, could imagine the people. At 5,000 feet, in darkness, through smoke and flame, everything became abstract. Coordinates, altitudes, bomb release points. The human dimension disappeared into the technical. This was not cruelty. It was pragmatism. Li Mei understood that asking men to incinerate cities required removing as much humanity from the equation as possible. The bombers would become machines executing a mission, not executioners confronting their actions. The date was set. The crews were briefed. On March 9, 334 B-29s would take off from airfields across the Marianas. Their target, a 12-square-mile zone in eastern Tokyo, home to over 1 million people and thousands of small industrial workshops. The attack would begin just after midnight. It would be the largest incendiary raid in history. For Lieutenant General Seizo Arishu, the evening of March 9 began like dozens before it. As head of military intelligence for the Imperial General Staff, Arishu spent his days analyzing reports, tracking American fleet movements, assessing the deteriorating strategic situation. By late evening, he was in his quarters beneath the Imperial Palace, reviewing reconnaissance summaries by candlelight. Electricity in Tokyo had become unreliable. The air raid sirens began at 10:30 p.m. This was not unusual. American B-29s had been probing Tokyo's defenses for weeks, sometimes in small groups, sometimes singly. The pattern had been frustrating, but manageable. A few bombs, some fires, then the bombers would disappear back into the Pacific darkness. Arisu had grown almost accustomed to the wailing sirens, the distant crump of anti-aircraft fire, the all-clear signal an hour later. But tonight felt different. The early warning stations along the coast reported not a handful of bombers, but hundreds. The formations were lower than usual, coming in waves spaced minutes apart. Arishu made his way to the command center, where staff officers crowded around maps studded with pins marking bomber positions. The numbers kept climbing: 50, 100, 200. General Masakazu Kawaibe, commander of air defenses, was already present, his face drawn, his fighter wings were scrambling, every available aircraft lifting off into the night. But there were perhaps 40 operational fighters across all of eastern Honshu. Against hundreds of B-29s it was symbolic resistance, nothing more. The first bombs fell at 12:15 a.m., March 10. They fell on Shitamachi, the low-lying eastern wards of Tokyo, where merchants and artisans lived in wooden houses packed so tightly that neighbors could hear each other breathe. The incendiaries came down in streams, each cluster bomb opening at 2,000 feet and scattering its payload across rooftops and alleyways. Within minutes, hundreds of individual fires had ignited. Arishu watched the reports flow in from district fire departments, police stations, military outposts. At first, the reports were professional, clinical. Fires at such and such intersection. Water mains intact, firefighters responding. Then the language changed. Multiple blazes spreading rapidly. Water pressure failing. Evacuation routes blocked. And then, communications lost. What Arisu and his fellow commanders did not yet understand, could not understand until the sun rose, was that they were not watching a bombing raid. They were watching the birth of a firestorm, a meteorological phenomenon where hundreds of individual fires merge into a single, self-sustaining inferno that generates its own hurricane, force winds. The physics are brutal and elegant. As fire consumes oxygen, it creates a vacuum. Cool air rushes in from the periphery to fill that vacuum, feeding the flames, which grow hotter and consume more oxygen, which draws in more air. The cycle accelerates. Winds reach 60, 70, 80 miles per hour, strong enough to uproot trees, to peel roofs from houses, to turn fleeing humans into torch-bearing projectiles. And the bombers kept coming. The B-29 Superfortress represented the bleeding edge of American industrial and technological power. Each aircraft cost $639,000, more than 3 times the price of a B-17 Flying Fortress. The development program had cost $3 billion more than the Manhattan Project. By early 1945, Boeing, Martin, and Bell were producing them at a rate of over 300 per month from factories scattered across Kansas, Nebraska, Georgia, and Washington state. The bomber's capabilities were staggering. It could fly higher, faster, and farther than any previous American heavy bomber. Its pressurized cabin meant crews could operate in relative comfort at altitudes where enemy fighters struggled. Its remote-controlled gun turrets, using analog computers to calculate lead and deflection, represented the most advanced fire control system in the world. But more important than any individual system was what the B-29 represented systemically: the ability of American industry to design, build, and deploy thousands of highly complex machines while simultaneously supporting a two-ocean war. Each B-29 required 55,000 engineering drawings, 600,000 rivets, and components from 1,500 subcontractors. The logistical infrastructure to keep them flying, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, trained crews, was itself a strategic weapon. Against this, Japan fielded what remained of its fighter force. The Kawasaki Ki-45 NIC was Japan's primary night fighter in early 1945, a twin-engine design with a top speed of 340 miles per hour and a ceiling around 33,000 feet. On paper, it could intercept a B-29. In practice, few pilots had the training to find bombers in the dark, and the aircraft's primitive radar, where it existed at all, was unreliable. More common were standard fighters pressed into night interception roles: the Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar, the Mitsubishi A6M0, even older biplanes armed with phosphorus bombs meant to be dropped onto bomber formations from above. These tactics occasionally succeeded. A handful of B-29s were destroyed by aerial ramming attacks, desperate pilots choosing suicide over surrender. But these were isolated victories in an ocean of defeat. Japanese anti-aircraft artillery was similarly outmatched. Most guns were 75mm or 88mm models dating from the 1930s, with optical sights and manual tracking. Against high-altitude targets, they had been largely ineffective. Against targets at 5,000 feet, they were more dangerous. But Japanese gunners faced the same problem as their pilots: finding targets in darkness and smoke. The technological gulf extended beyond hardware to systems, to organization, to doctrine. American bombers flew with fighter escorts when needed, operated from bases with radar, weather forecasting, and advanced communications. Damaged aircraft could limp back to Iwo Jima, captured from Japan in February 1945, for emergency landings. Crews who bailed out over the Pacific could be retrieved by submarines or seaplanes. Japanese defenders had none of this. Damaged fighters crashed. Shot down pilots died. Communication between units was by telephone or radio sets that barely worked. There was no integrated defense network, no centralized command, no way to mass force where it was needed. In the skies over Tokyo on the night of March 9-10, this asymmetry would become a massacre. On the ground, in the Shitamachi district of Tokyo, Michiko-kyo, Oka was putting her children to bed when the sirens began. She was 29 years old, a factory worker whose husband had been conscripted 2 years earlier and sent to Manchuria. She lived with her 3 children, ages 8, 5, and 3, and her elderly mother-in-law in a 2-room wooden house on a street so narrow 2 people could barely pass without turning sideways. When the sirens wailed, Michiko did what she had been trained to do. She gathered the children, wrapped them in wet blankets, and moved them into the street. The neighborhood fire warden was already outside, shouting instructions: stay calm, watch for incendiaries, be ready with sand and water buckets. Do not run unless ordered. The first fires appeared 3 blocks away, sudden orange blooms climbing into the night sky. Then closer. Then on her own street. The M69 canisters punched through roof tiles and ignited, spewing jellied gasoline that stuck to wood and flesh alike. Within minutes, a dozen houses were burning. The heat was immediate and overwhelming, like standing too close to an industrial furnace. Michiko made the decision to run. She picked up her youngest child, grabbed the 5-year-old's hand, told the 8-year-old to hold on to her mother-in-law. They joined a river of people flooding toward the Sumida River, the nearest open space. The streets were chaos. Families clutching bundles, elderly being carried on backs, children separated and screaming. The smoke was so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Then, the firestorm winds began. Survivors would later describe it as a living thing, a roaring beast that pulled the air from their lungs and turned the sky into a churning ocean of flame. Winds reached 80 miles per hour, strong enough to lift small children off their feet. The temperature at ground level exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite clothing before fire even touched skin. Michiko never reached the river. Somewhere in the crush of bodies and smoke, she lost her grip on her daughter's hand. The crowd surged forward. People trampled those who fell. The heat became unbearable. Michiko clutched her youngest child and pressed forward, screaming her other children's names into the roar. By dawn, Michiko was one of perhaps 100 Zalhosen survivors from Shitamachi. Her youngest child survived with her. Her other two children and her mother-in-law did not. Their bodies were never identified. Impossible to distinguish among the tens of thousands of charred corpses that would be found in the days that followed. This was not Michiko's story alone. It was the story repeated across 16 square miles of Tokyo that night. It was the story of families who suffocated in bomb shelters when the firestorm consumed all the oxygen. Of people who jumped into canals and rivers only to be boiled alive as the water heated. Of those who survived by submerging themselves completely, breathing through wet cloth, only to emerge hours later to find their neighborhoods erased. The official death toll from the Tokyo raid would eventually be estimated at over 100,000, more than either atomic bombing. Another 1 million were made homeless. 16 square miles of the city, roughly a quarter of its total area, had been completely burned out. And this was only the first night. The question that would haunt historians for decades was simple: was it justified? Limei himself never expressed doubt, at least not publicly. Years after the war, he stated bluntly, "I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal." He understood what he had done. He also believed it had been necessary to end the war and save lives. American lives primarily, but also Japanese lives that would be lost in an invasion. The moral framework of 1945 was different from today's. Total war had become normalized. The distinction between combatants and civilians had been steadily eroding since the German Blitz on London, the Allied firebombing of Hamburg and Dresden, the systematic destruction of German cities. By the time Limei began his campaign against Japan, the precedent had been set. Cities were legitimate military targets. Moreover, Japan's war economy genuinely was dispersed into residential areas. American intelligence photographs showed workshops producing aircraft parts, military uniforms, and weapons scattered throughout neighborhoods. Precision strikes against these targets were impossible. They were too small, too numerous, too hidden. The only way to destroy them was to destroy everything around them. There was also the argument from necessity. Every day the war continued, Allied prisoners of war died in Japanese camps. Chinese civilians died under Japanese occupation. Allied soldiers died in the Pacific. If the bombing campaign could shorten the war by even weeks, the lives saved might outnumber the lives lost. But these arguments, however sincerely held, could not erase certain truths. The majority of those killed in Tokyo on March 9-10 were women, children, and elderly. Those who could not fight, who posed no military threat. The incendiary bombs were specifically designed to maximize destruction of wooden residential areas. The tactics, night attacks, low altitude, mass incendiaries, were optimized for killing efficiency, not military precision. This was not collateral damage. It was the intended outcome. Some within the American military expressed disquiet. Brigadier General Bonner Fellers, a military intelligence officer close to General MacArthur, wrote in a memo that the indiscriminate bombing of cities might violate the fundamental principles of humanity and the laws of war. But such voices were rare and carried little weight. The momentum of total war, the desire for revenge after Pearl Harbor, and the genuine belief that breaking Japan's will was necessary for victory all combined to silence most moral objections. In Tokyo, among Japanese military commanders, the moral questions were different but equally agonizing. Should they continue to sacrifice cities and civilians in a war they knew could not be won? Was continued resistance honorable, or was it a cruel prolonging of suffering? These debates played out in hushed conversations in secure rooms, never in public, never officially recorded. But the bombing campaign was forcing the question into the open. Every night that the bombers came, every city that burned, made it harder to justify the fiction of imminent victory. What made the 1945 air campaign psychologically devastating was not just its intensity, but its relentlessness. In previous campaigns, over Germany, over Japanese cities in late 1944, there had been rhythm, predictability. A raid would come, cause destruction, then there would be days or weeks of respite. Time to clear rubble, restore services, bury the dead, repair infrastructure. Time to adapt and harden defenses. LeMay understood that this rhythm allowed the enemy to endure, so he removed it. After Tokyo on March 10, there was no pause. On March 11, Nagoya was hit by 310 B-29s, 2 square miles of the city burned. On March 13, Osaka, nearly 300 bombers, 8 square miles destroyed. On March 16, Kobe, another 300 aircraft, 3 square miles gone. On March 19, Nagoya again. In 10 days, LeMay's ex-bomber command flew 5 major incendiary raids, dropped 500 tons of bombs, and burned out roughly 32 square miles of Japan's 4 largest industrial cities. Japanese casualties exceeded 150,000 dead. And then, just as suddenly, the raids stopped. Not because LeMay wanted them to stop, but because his bombers had run out of incendiary bombs. The supply chain from the United States could not keep pace with the rate of destruction. Warehouses in the Marianas were empty. It would take weeks for new shipments to arrive. This accidental pause revealed something profound about the Japanese military psychology. In the 2 weeks following the March raids, Japanese commanders did not surrender. They did not sue for peace. Instead, they attempted to reorganize defenses, relocate factories, prepare for the next onslaught. The willingness to endure, to continue fighting even when the outcome was inevitable, was both Japan's greatest strength and its deepest tragedy. It was rooted in cultural concepts of honor, in the shame of surrender, in the belief, drilled into every soldier and citizen, that death was preferable to defeat. But it was also sustained by a deliberate campaign of misinformation. The Japanese government censored casualty reports, downplayed the effectiveness of American bombing, and maintained the fiction that final victory was achievable. Ordinary citizens had no access to accurate information about the war's progress. They knew their cities were burning, but they were told this was temporary, that countermeasures were being developed, that the Americans would be defeated. For military commanders like Arisu and Kawaib, who had access to real intelligence, the psychological burden was crushing. They knew the truth. They knew the war was lost. But the culture they inhabited offered no honorable path to acknowledgement. To speak openly of defeat was to invite accusations of defeatism, cowardice, treason. So they remained silent and prepared for the next raids. When the bombing resumed in April, with renewed ferocity, that silence would become unbearable. The Americans were not just destroying cities. They were destroying the psychological infrastructure that held Japanese resistance together. Each raid stripped away another layer of the illusion. Each night of flames made it harder to believe in victory, harder to justify sacrifice, harder to maintain the discipline that total war required. The final air raid never stopped, because LeMay understood something fundamental about modern warfare. Victory comes not just from destroying the enemy's ability to fight, but from destroying their will to continue. And will, unlike steel and concrete, could be eroded by the simple, terrible arithmetic of relentless pressure applied without mercy or pause. The Japanese commanders were shocked because they had never imagined an enemy capable of such sustained, industrial-scale destruction. An enemy that could burn their cities and then burn them again. An enemy that could turn the sky itself into a weapon that never slept, never tired, never stopped. They were about to learn that March was only the beginning. March 9, 1945. 11:48 p.m. On the island of Guam, 500 miles south of Tokyo, the first B-29s began their takeoff rolls. The runway at North Field stretched nearly 2 miles across coral and crushed stone, carved from jungle by bulldozers and the labor of thousands of CBs. In the darkness, the field looked like a river of light. Flares marking taxi paths, ground crews with flashlights guiding bombers into position, towers of stacked incendiary bombs glowing dully under floodlights. Captain Robert Fitzgerald sat in the cockpit of City of Los Angeles, his hands steady on the throttles as his flight engineer called out final checks. Behind him, the fuselage was packed with M69 cluster bombs, 14 tons of jellied gasoline in thin steel casings, no ammunition for the defensive turrets, no gunners. Just bombs, fuel, and a crew of 10 men who understood they were about to do something unprecedented. Fitzgerald advanced the throttles. The 4 right radial engines roared. The bomber accelerated, slowly at first. The weight was enormous, then faster. At 140 miles per hour, Fitzgerald pulled back on the yoke. The B-29 lifted into tropical darkness, banking north toward Japan. Behind him, another bomber lifted off. then another, then another. Every 30 seconds, another superfortress took to the air. By midnight, 334 B-29s were airborne from 3 airfields across the Marianas, Guam, Tinian and Saipan. They flew in loose formations, staggered by altitude and timing. The lead Pathfinder aircraft carried a mix of incendiaries and high explosives, tasked with marking the target zone, with massive fires visible from miles away. The main force would follow, dropping their loads into the growing inferno. The flight north took 6 hours. Crews dozed at their stations, conserved oxygen, checked instruments by red, filtered flashlights. At 5,000 feet, the bombers flew beneath most cloud cover, through air thick and turbulent. Some men prayed. Others smoked, despite regulations. A few tried to sleep but found it impossible, their minds racing ahead to what awaited them over Tokyo. March 10, 1945, 2:08 a.m. The first Pathfinder aircraft, call sign Pathfinder Able, crossed the Japanese coastline southeast of Tokyo. Below, the city stretched out like a carpet of dim lights, blackout regulations, making it darker than peacetime but still visible in the clear night. Navigation lights along the Sumida River traced silver lines through the urban sprawl. To Bombardier Captain Thomas Power, looking through his Norden bomb sight, it looked oddly peaceful. That was about to change. At 12:15 a.m., Pathfinder Able released its load, a mix of incendiary clusters and 500-pound high explosive bombs, over the Shitamachi district. The high explosives were designed to blow apart buildings, exposing wooden frames and creating kindling. The incendiaries followed seconds later, showering down across rooftops and streets. Within 2 minutes, a massive X-shaped pattern of fire marked the target zone. 4 square miles of residential and light industrial neighborhoods, now outlined in flame. The main force saw the fires from 50 miles away. Fitzgerald, in city of Los Angeles, was in the second wave. As his bomber approached the target area, the sky ahead glowed orange, then red, then something beyond red. A color that seemed to pulse and breathe. Smoke was already rising to 10,000 feet, thick and black. The smell reached them even at altitude. Acrid, chemical, organic. Target visual. Fitzgerald called over the intercom. Bombardier, you have the aircraft. Below, Tokyo was beginning to die. The firestorm was already forming. The initial Pathfinder loads had ignited hundreds of individual blazes. Fed by timber houses, paper screens, and tatami mats, these fires spread with terrifying speed. Wind from the fires themselves began to generate powerful updrafts, drawing in cool air from surrounding areas. That wind fanned the flames, which grew hotter and drew in more air. The cycle accelerated. By 12:30 a.m., ground temperatures in the heart of the target zone exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. On the ground, air raid wardens and firefighters attempted to respond. But the scale was overwhelming. Tokyo's fire department had equipment and training for structure fires, not urban conflagrations. Water mains burst under the strain. Fire trucks found streets blocked by rubble and fleeing civilians. Pumps overheated. Hoses melted. And still the bombers came. At 12:45 a.m., Captain James Campbell in Shady Lady made his run at 200 feet. Through his windscreen, he could see individual streets, could see fires spreading from roof to roof like a living thing. His bombardier released. 14 tons of incendiaries tumbling down, clusters opening, bomblets scattering. Campbell felt the aircraft lurch upward as the weight dropped away. Then turbulence hit, violent updrafts from the firestorm below. The B-29 bucked and rolled. Instruments spun. For a terrifying moment, Campbell thought he would lose control. But his co-pilot grabbed his yoke, and together they wrestled the bomber level. Jesus Christ. His flight engineer whispered over the intercom. It's like flying over a volcano. It was an apt comparison. The firestorm had developed its own meteorology, its own physics. Superheated air rose in massive columns, reaching altitudes where B-29s flew. The turbulence was so severe that some bombers were flipped inverted. Tail sections cracked. Crews vomited from the violent motion. Instruments failed as electrical systems overloaded from the electromagnetic chaos. And yet, they kept coming. By 100 a.m., 150 B-29s had dropped their loads. The target area was completely obscured by smoke and flame. Bombardiers could no longer see aiming points. They simply released over the general coordinates, trusting that somewhere below, their bombs would find fuel. They did. The firestorm was now fully developed, a single massive inferno covering 12 square miles. Winds at ground level reached 70 miles per hour, hurricane force. Trees were uprooted. Entire houses lifted off foundations and disintegrated in mid-air. Bodies, those caught in the open, were picked up and flung like leaves, their clothing ignited, hair burning away in seconds. In bomb shelters beneath the firestorm, families huddled together, water-soaked blankets over their heads. But the shelters became ovens. The fire consumed oxygen faster than ventilation could replace it. People suffocated, or died from carbon monoxide poisoning, or cooked from radiant heat that seeped through concrete walls. Those who fled found no escape. Canals and rivers filled with thousands of people seeking refuge from the heat. But the water offered no safety. As the firestorm intensified, the water temperature rose, 100 degrees, 120 degrees, 140 degrees. People boiled alive or drowned as the crush of bodies forced them underwater. At the Sumida River, the largest waterway through eastern Tokyo, the surface became a carpet of corpses. Estimates would later count over 30,000 bodies in that river alone. By 200 a.m., the bombing had been underway for nearly 2 hours, and Japanese defenses were in complete disarray. Searchlight batteries attempted to illuminate targets for anti-aircraft guns. But the smoke was so thick that the beams simply diffused into useless glow. Flak gunners fired blind into the darkness, hoping for lucky hits. A few shells found their marks. B-29s were hit. Engines damaged, fires started. But compared to the relentless stream of bombers overhead, these victories were meaningless. Japanese night fighters managed to take off from airfields around Tokyo. Perhaps 30 aircraft total. They climbed into darkness, searching for the American formation. A few pilots got lucky. Lieutenant Ezamu Kashide, flying a Kawasaki Ki-45, spotted a B-29 silhouetted against the flames below. He closed to 300 yards and opened fire with his 20mm cannon. The bomber's starboard wing erupted in flame. It rolled inverted and plunged into the inferno below. But Kashide's fighter was immediately bracketed by turbulence from the firestorm. His aircraft flipped, stalled, and went into a spin. He fought the controls, recovering barely 1,000 feet above the burning city. When he landed 20 minutes later, his hands were shaking so badly he could not unbuckle his harness without help. Most Japanese fighters never found a target. They circled uselessly in smoke and darkness, their fuel running low, their pilots disoriented. Some landed at alternate airfields. Others crashed trying to land in zero visibility. By 300 a.m., organized air defense had effectively ceased. In his command post beneath the Imperial Palace, Lieutenant General Arisu watched the situation deteriorate with a growing sense of horror. Reports from the target zone had become sporadic, then stopped entirely. Telephone lines were down. Radio communications were garbled by static and interference from the fires. All he could see was what was visible from the palace itself, a hemisphere of orange light to the east, smoke rising in columns that blotted out the stars. At 20:30 a.m., an aide brought him a damage assessment compiled from spotty reports, at least 10 square miles burning, possibly more. Casualties unknown, but believed to be in the tens of thousands. Fire department overwhelmed. Military assistance requested but impossible to coordinate. Arisu read the report twice, then set it down carefully. He walked to the reinforced window and stared out at the glow. For 3.5 years, he had studied American capabilities, analyzed their strategies, predicted their movements. He had known, intellectually, that Japan could not win a war of industrial attrition against the United States. But knowing and seeing were different things. What he was witnessing was not a military operation. It was erasure. The systematic deletion of a city and everyone in it, conducted with industrial precision by an enemy that had turned warfare into an engineering problem. And the bombers were still coming. The raid continued until 3:14 a.m., 3 hours of continuous bombing. By the time the last B-29 turned south toward the Marianas, 1,665 tons of incendiaries had been dropped on Tokyo. Over 279 individual M69 bomblets had scattered across the target zone, each one a 6-pound stick of napalm burning at temperatures that melted glass and steel. 16 square miles of Tokyo, an area larger than Manhattan below 59th Street, had been reduced to ash and rubble. As dawn broke on March 10, the full scope of the destruction became visible. From the air, reconnaissance aircraft photographed a landscape that looked less like a city and more like the surface of a dead planet. Where neighborhoods had stood, there was only gray ash and the skeletal remains of concrete buildings. Bridges had collapsed into rivers choked with bodies. Parks that had served as evacuation zones were blackened fields studded with charred corpses. Thousands of people who had fled there for safety only to be overtaken by the firestorm. The death toll would never be precisely known. Official Japanese government estimates eventually settled on approximately 100,000 killed, with another 1 million made homeless. Some historians believe the true number was higher, perhaps 130,000 or more. In a single night, more people died in Tokyo than would died in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima 5 months later. For the American crews returning to the Marianas, the mission was recorded as a complete success. 14 B-29s had been lost, a loss rate of just 4.2%, far lower than the predicted 10%. Crew debriefings reported excellent visibility, minimal fighter opposition, and near total destruction of the target area. General Limei, reviewing the reconnaissance photos in his headquarters on Guam, permitted himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The gamble had worked. Low-altitude incendiary attacks were devastatingly effective. The path forward was clear. But in Tokyo, for those who survived, there was no clarity, only incomprehension. Michiko Oka, the young mother who had lost 2 of her 3 children in the flames, stumbled through the ruins of Shitamachi as the sun rose. The streets she had known her entire life were unrecognizable. Buildings were gone. Landmarks had vanished. The only way to navigate was by following canals. The water at least marked consistent geography, though the bodies floating in them made the journey a nightmare. She found other survivors in a partially destroyed school building. Perhaps 40 people, mostly women and elderly, huddled in a classroom that had somehow escaped the flames. No one spoke. What was there to say? They had lived through something beyond language, beyond comprehension. An elderly man finally broke the silence. "When will they come back?" he asked. No one answered, because everyone knew the truth. The Americans would come back. Tonight or tomorrow night or the night after. They would come back because they could, because there was nothing to stop them, because the war was lost and everyone knew it except the men in power who refused to admit it. The old man asked the question that all of them were thinking, but none dared voice. How do you surrender when the enemy won't stop long enough to accept it? Across Japan, in secure rooms and command centers, military leaders were asking themselves the same question. General Kawabe, commander of air defenses, submitted a report to Imperial General Headquarters on March 11. It was clinical, factual, devastating. The enemy has demonstrated the ability to destroy our cities at will. Current defensive capabilities are insufficient to prevent or significantly reduce this destruction. Without immediate and substantial reinforcement, fighters, pilots, fuel, ammunition, we cannot defend the home islands from strategic bombing. The report was filed and ignored. The official response was a directive to strengthen fighting spirit and prepare for decisive battle. But fighting spirit could not stop incendiary bombs. And the decisive battle was not going to be fought on beaches or in the skies. It was going to be fought in the burned out shells of Japan's cities, one firestorm at a time. The shock that Japanese commanders felt on the morning of March 10 was not just shock at the scale of destruction. It was the shock of realization. The sudden, terrible understanding that the rules of warfare had changed, that their concepts of defense and endurance were obsolete, that they were facing an enemy who had industrialized annihilation. And that enemy was just getting started. The night of March 11, Nagoya burned. The night of March 13, Osaka burned. The night of March 16, Kobe burned. The final air raid never stopped because it was not an event. It was a process. A systematic, relentless campaign that would continue, with only brief pauses for resupply, until either Japan surrendered or there were no more cities left to burn. For Japanese commanders watching their nation immolate, the shock gave way to something darker. The understanding that they had led their country into a war against an enemy whose capacity for destruction exceeded anything they had imagined possible. And there was no way out except through the fire. The morning of March 11, 1945, Tokyo smoldered beneath an overcast sky. Smoke from the previous night's raid had formed a pall that stretched for miles, visible from ships 100 miles offshore. The smell, a nauseating mixture of charred wood, melted synthetics, and burned flesh, hung in the air so thick that rescue workers tied cloth over their faces just to breathe. In the Shitamachi district, nothing remained but ash and the twisted metal skeletons of what had once been shops, homes, and workshops. The immediate priority was the dead. Teams of soldiers, police, and civilian volunteers moved through the ruins with stretchers and carts, collecting bodies. But the scale was overwhelming. Many corpses were burned beyond recognition, reduced to charred shapes, barely identifiable as human. Others had been carbonized entirely, crumbling to ash when touched. In areas where the firestorm had been most intense, there were no bodies at all. Only shadows burned into concrete, outlines of people who had simply vaporized in the heat. Mass cremation sites were established in parks and open fields. Soldiers stacked bodies, like cordwood, doused them with whatever flammable liquid could be found, and set them alight. The smoke from these pyres joined the smoke still rising from the city itself. Buddhist priests chanted sutras over the fires, but there were not enough priests for the number of dead. Most bodies were burned without ceremony, their ashes collected in unmarked urns. By March 15, the official count stood at 83,793 dead. By March 20, it had risen to 97,031. The final estimate would exceed 100,000, but even that number was questionable. Thousands of bodies were never recovered. Entire families had been wiped out with no one left to report them missing. The transient population, workers from other cities, refugees from earlier bombings, existed in no official records. The destruction of infrastructure was equally catastrophic. 16 square miles of Tokyo had been burned flat. Over 267,000 buildings were completely destroyed, roughly a quarter of the city's total structures. Water mains had burst from the heat, leaving vast areas without running water. Electrical substations had melted. Telephone exchanges were ash. The Sumida River, its surface still dotted with bloated corpses, was contaminated and unusable. Food distribution collapsed almost immediately. The warehouses and distribution centers in eastern Tokyo had been in the target zone. Rice stocks, canned goods, emergency rations, all gone. Within 2 days, surviving residents were facing starvation. The government promised relief but could not deliver it. The transportation infrastructure was too damaged, and resources were stretched too thin across a nation already under siege. Homelessness reached catastrophic levels. 1 million people, 1 million, had lost their homes in a single night. They sheltered in ruins, in temples, in schools, in any structure that had survived. The government ordered evacuations to the countryside, but the rail system could not handle the volume. Refugees walked, carrying what little they had salvaged, streaming out of Tokyo in columns that stretched for miles. And then, on March 11, barely 36 hours after the Tokyo raid, the bombers came again. This time the target was Nagoya, Japan's third largest city and a center of aircraft production. The raid followed the same pattern: 3 10B-29s, low-altitude, night attack incendiaries. 2 square miles of the city burned. Another 2,000 dead. The fires were still smoldering when reconnaissance photos reached LeMay's headquarters. On March 13, Osaka burned. Nearly 300 bombers. 8 square miles destroyed. At least 4,000 dead. On March 16, Kobe burned. 3 square miles gone. Over 8,000 dead. In 10 days, LeMay's command flew 6 major incendiary raids against Japan's 4 largest cities. The raids delivered over 9,000 tons of bombs, destroyed approximately 32 square miles of urban area, and killed an estimated 150,000 people. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the physical destruction. For ordinary Japanese citizens, the rapid succession of raids shattered any remaining belief in protection or safety. The government had promised that air defenses would improve, that countermeasures were being developed, that the American bombing campaign would be defeated. None of it was true. The bombers came whenever they wanted, destroyed whatever they targeted, and left with minimal losses. The propaganda that had sustained civilian morale, the rhetoric of invincibility, of inevitable victory, of divine protection, collapsed in the face of observable reality. People could see that their cities were burning. They could count the dead. They could watch the endless streams of homeless refugees and understand that the government had no answer to American air power. In factories and workshops that had survived the bombing, absenteeism skyrocketed. Workers simply stopped showing up, fleeing to rural areas or staying home to protect their families. Production of aircraft engines and munitions, already declining due to material shortages, plummeted further. The very industrial capacity the bombing was meant to destroy was crumbling not just from the raids themselves, but from the societal breakdown they caused. Within the Japanese military command structure, the raids triggered a crisis of confidence that would ripple through the remaining months of the war. General Kowabe, whose air defense command had proven utterly incapable of stopping the B-29s, submitted his resignation on March 18. It was refused, not because he had succeeded, but because replacing him would be an admission of failure. Instead, he was given additional responsibilities and told to reinvigorate defensive efforts. It was a meaningless directive. There were no reinforcements to send. Fighter production could not keep pace with losses. Fuel stocks were critically low, so low that training flights had been virtually eliminated. The few experienced pilots remaining were being hoarded for a final, suicidal defense of the home islands when the American invasion came. Lieutenant General Arisu, watching the situation from his intelligence post, understood that Japan was trapped in a death spiral. Each bombing raid weakened the nation's ability to resist the next one. Each city destroyed meant fewer factories, fewer workers, less production. The Americans could continue this indefinitely, grinding Japan down month by month, while suffering minimal losses themselves. In private conversations with trusted colleagues, Arisu began to speak of the unthinkable negotiated peace. Not victory, peace. An end to the war before Japan was completely destroyed. But these were dangerous thoughts. Defeatism was a crime punishable by arrest, imprisonment, or worse. And even raising the possibility of surrender risked being labeled a traitor to the emperor and the nation. So, Arisu remained silent in public, filed his reports, and watched Japan burn. The pause came in early April, but it was not mercy, it was logistics. LeMay's bombers had expended their entire stock of incendiary munitions. The supply line from the United States to the Marianas, though efficient, could not keep pace with the rate at which his command was burning Japanese cities. Warehouses at Northfield, Guam, and the airfields on Tinian and Saipan sat empty, waiting for freighters carrying thousands of tons of MN-69 cluster bombs to arrive from ports in California. The 2-week lull gave Japan a chance to assess the damage and attempt recovery. It also gave military planners a chance to confront the reality they had been avoiding: the war could not be won, and continued resistance would result in Japan's total annihilation. On April 5, a meeting of the Supreme War Council convened in Tokyo. The 6 most powerful military and civilian leaders in Japan, including Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Taug, and the chiefs of the Army and Navy General Staffs. The official agenda was to discuss strategic adjustments. The unspoken agenda was whether Japan should seek terms to end the war. The debate was agonizing and inconclusive. Foreign Minister Togi argued that Japan's position was hopeless, that the American bombing campaign could not be stopped, and that the only rational course was to seek mediation, perhaps through the Soviet Union, which had not yet entered the Pacific War. Better to negotiate now, while Japan still had some bargaining position, than to wait until the country was completely destroyed. The military chiefs rejected this immediately. Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu insisted that Japan's strategic situation, while difficult, was not desperate. The bulk of the army remained intact. The Navy still possessed kamikaze forces. An American invasion could be made so costly that the enemy would accept a negotiated peace rather than fight to the finish. What neither side could say openly was that the real obstacle to surrender was not military, but cultural and political. The concept of unconditional surrender, which the Allies had demanded since 1943, was unthinkable within the framework of Japanese military tradition. It meant dishonor, humiliation, and the potential destruction of the imperial system itself. For many in Japan's leadership, death was preferable to such shame. The meeting ended without resolution. The war would continue, but outside the secure conference rooms, on the streets of Tokyo and Nagoya and Osaka, ordinary citizens were reaching different conclusions. By mid-April, the evacuation of Japan's cities had become a mass exodus. Government orders mandated that schoolchildren, elderly, and non-essential workers relocate to rural areas. But the orders were largely unnecessary. People were fleeing on their own. Trains departing Tokyo and other major cities were packed beyond capacity, with people clinging to roofs and riding between cars. Those who could not get on trains walked, sometimes for days, to reach relatives in the countryside. The social fabric of urban Japan was disintegrating. Neighborhoods that had existed for centuries were abandoned overnight. Shops closed. Schools emptied. Temples and shrines, which had served as community anchors for generations, stood vacant as priests and congregants fled. In the countryside, the influx of refugees created its own crisis. Rural communities, already struggling with food shortages due to crop failures and naval blockades, could barely feed their own populations. The arrival of thousands, then tens of thousands, of urban refugees strained resources to the breaking point. Tensions flared. There were reports of refugees being turned away, of food riots, of families sleeping in fields because villages would not take them in. The Japan of April 1945 was a nation fracturing under pressure, and the pressure was about to intensify. On April 13, with fresh stocks of incendiaries having arrived from the United States, LeMay resumed the campaign. The target was Tokyo again, this time the northwestern districts that had escaped the March 10 raid. Over 300 B-29s dropped more than 2,000 tons of incendiaries. Another 11 square miles burned. At least 500 more dead. The pattern was now established and would continue for the next 4 months. Raids every few days, sometimes multiple cities in a single night, a relentless cycle of destruction that gave Japan no time to recover or adapt. In May, the tempo increased further. Nagoya was hit again. Yokohama burned, over 500 bombers, the largest raid yet, 14 square miles destroyed. Kobe was struck a second time. Then Tokyo a third time. Smaller cities began to appear on the target list. Tokuyama, T-Muta, Yokkaichi, places with no significant military value but important enough to the economy that their destruction would matter. By the end of May, LeMay's command had flown over 50 major incendiary raids. Over 100 square miles of Japanese cities had been burned out. Estimates of civilian dead ranged from 250,000 to 400,000. The numbers were so large, and the reporting so fragmentary, that precise counts became impossible. Japanese air defenses, already ineffective in March, had virtually ceased to exist by June. Fighter units were grounded due to lack of fuel. Anti-aircraft ammunition stocks were depleted. Radar stations had been destroyed or abandoned. B-29 crews reported flying over cities with no opposition whatsoever. Not a single searchlight, not a round of flak, nothing but the fires they themselves had started. The campaign entered its final phase in July. LeMay's bombers began dropping leaflets before raids, warning civilians to evacuate specific cities that were about to be targeted. The leaflets listed 12 cities by name and stated, in Japanese, that they would be destroyed within days. Some historians have argued this was an attempt to minimize civilian casualties. Others point out that the warnings also served a psychological purpose, forcing Japanese civilians to confront the fact that their own government could not protect them, and spreading panic across the entire nation. The warnings worked. When the bombers came, as they always did, the targeted cities were often partially evacuated. But the evacuations themselves created chaos, clogged roads, disrupted what remained of the economy, and spread the sense of helplessness even to cities that had not yet been bombed. By late July, Japan's urban infrastructure had been systematically dismantled. The rail network barely functioned, ports were mined and unusable. Electrical generation had dropped by 70%. Food distribution had collapsed entirely in many areas. Industrial production of war materials had fallen to a fraction of 1944 levels. The final air raid never stopped, because LeMay never let it stop. Even in the last weeks of the war, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9, conventional bombing continued. On August 14, the day before Japan announced its surrender, over 1,000 B-29s flew missions against Japanese targets. It was the largest single-day raid of the entire war. When Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast was played over radio on August 15, 1945, millions of Japanese heard it amid the ruins of their cities. For many, the primary emotion was not shame or grief, but relief. The bombs would finally stop falling. In the imperial palace, Lieutenant General Arisu listened to the emperor's words. The first time most Japanese had ever heard their sovereign's voice. The language was formal, archaic, almost incomprehensible to ordinary citizens. But the meaning was clear: the war was over. Japan had lost. Arisu felt something break inside him, not his spirit, that had broken weeks ago, watching Tokyo burn. What broke was the last thread of denial, the final pretense that Japan's sacrifice had been meaningful or necessary. They had known they could not win. They had known since Midway, perhaps earlier. And yet they had continued, sending young men to die in kamikaze attacks, watching cities burn, sacrificing civilians by the hundreds of thousands, clinging to the fiction of honor and victory until there was nothing left to sacrifice. The final air raid had never stopped because Japan had never been able to make it stop. Not through defenses, not through resistance, not through endurance. Only surrender could stop it, and surrender had been unthinkable, until it became inevitable. Arisu walked to the same reinforced window where he had stood on the night of March 10. The sky was clear now, no longer orange with flames. Tokyo lay silent beneath a gray haze. Somewhere in the ruins, survivors were listening to the same broadcast, trying to comprehend what peace meant after so many months of fire. The shock Japanese commanders had felt in March, the shock of facing an enemy whose capacity for destruction exceeded imagination, had transformed over the months into something else. Not acceptance, exactly, but understanding. They had been shocked because they had thought of war in terms of battles, campaigns, victories, and defeats. The Americans had thought of it in terms of industrial output, tonnage delivered, and cities destroyed per month. It was the difference between warfare as an art and warfare as engineering. Japan had lost not because its soldiers lacked courage or its commanders lacked skill. It had lost because it had entered a war against a nation that could turn the sky itself into an assembly line for death and keep that line running without pause until nothing remained. The final air raid never stopped, and when it finally did, Japan was gone, not as a nation or a people, but as the country it had been. In its place was ash, rubble, and the terrible knowledge of what modern war could do when waged without mercy or limit. In the years after the war, historians would debate the necessity and morality of the fire-bombing campaign. Numbers would be compiled, analyzed, compared. The tonnage dropped over 147,000 tons of bombs. The cities destroyed 67 urban areas reduced to varying degrees of rubble and ash. The dead, estimates ranging from 300,000 to 500,000 civilians, possibly more. These numbers are precise and meaningless at the same time. They capture scale but not experience. They measure destruction but not suffering. They record what was done but cannot explain what it meant to live through it, or to carry out the orders that made it happen. Curtis LeMay never expressed public regret. He believed, until his death, that the campaign shortened the war and saved lives. American lives certainly, but also Japanese lives that would have been lost in an invasion. The mathematics of his argument were cold but not irrational. 500,000 dead in 6 months of bombing versus potentially millions dead in a year-long invasion. By that calculus, the fire-bombing was not just justified, it was merciful. But mathematics cannot account for the mother who watched her children burn, for the pilot who could smell the smoke of burning cities seeping into his pressurized cabin, for the commander who gave orders knowing they would result in mass death, and who carried that knowledge for the rest of his life. The final air raid that never stopped revealed something fundamental about modern warfare, that technology had outpaced humanity's ability to comprehend its own destructiveness. The B-29, the incendiary bomb, the doctrine of strategic bombing, these were not evil inventions. They were tools, engineered with precision and deployed with purpose. But their aggregate effect was to transform war from a contest between armies into a systematic erasure of entire societies. Japan's commanders were shocked not because they were naive about war's brutality. They had conducted their own campaigns of terror across Asia. They were shocked because they had underestimated the scale at which industrial warfare could operate when fully unleashed. They had imagined war as something episodic, something with rhythm and pause. The Americans showed them war as a continuous process, an industrial operation that ran 24 hours a day until the job was complete. The legacy of that campaign extends far beyond Japan's surrender. It established precedents that would shape conflicts for decades, that civilian infrastructure could be legitimate targets, that overwhelming force could break an enemy's will, that the distinction between combatant and non-combatant could dissolve in the logic of total war. But it also planted seeds of doubt that would grow in the years that followed. The same questions that troubled a few voices in 1945 would become central debates by the 1960s and beyond. What are the limits of acceptable force? When does military necessity become atrocity? Is there such a thing as victory if it requires becoming as monstrous as the enemy you fight? These questions have no simple answers. Perhaps they have no answers at all. What remains is memory, fragmented, painful, necessary. The memory of cities that burned, of families that vanished, of young men in bomber cockpits who did what they were told and spent the rest of their lives wondering if they should have refused, of a nation that fought beyond hope and paid a price measured in ash and silence. The final air raid stopped on August 15, 1945. But in a deeper sense, it never stopped at all. It continues in the questions we still ask about what war should be, what limits should constrain it, what price is too high to pay for victory. Japan's commanders were shocked when the final air raid never stopped. But perhaps the deeper shock, the one we should still feel today, is that it was allowed to happen at all. That human beings, with full knowledge of what they were doing, chose to turn the sky into an instrument of annihilation and applied it with methodical efficiency until an entire nation lay in ruins. That is not a judgment. It is an observation. And it is a warning that echoes still in every conflict where technology offers solutions that our humanity cannot quite accept, but which we deploy anyway, because the alternative seems worse, or because we have run out of other options, or simply because we can. The bombers returned to their bases. The fires eventually burned out. The survivors rebuilt. But the sky remembers.